My name is Madison Clark. I'm 33 years old. I manage a luxury hotel in downtown Philadelphia. And 6 months ago, my older sister looked at my father in a hospital waiting room while I lay unconscious with tubes in my throat, and my heart barely holding together, and she said, "Let her die. We won't pay for the surgery. Think about what that money could do for us." She didn't whisper it. She didn't hesitate. She said it the way you'd cancel a reservation. Clear, practical, final. My father didn't argue. He didn't push back. He didn't say, "Wait, that's my daughter in there. Let me think about this." He looked at Olivia, his oldest, the one he'd always trusted, the one who'd always agreed with him, and he nodded. They stood up. They walked out of the hospital together. They did not sign the surgical consent form. They did not look through the glass at me lying in that bed. They did not come back. I woke up 3 weeks later, broken, bruised, barely able to lift my own head, and when I found out what my family had done while I was unconscious, I realized the refusal to save my life wasn't even the worst part. What I did in the weeks that followed didn't just change my life, it collapsed theirs, and they never saw it coming because they forgot one thing about me. Before I go on, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely speaks to you. Now let me take you back to where it all started. I was born with a hole in my heart. Ventricular septal defect. That's what the cardiologist called it when my mother asked why her newborn daughter wasn't breathing right. I was 2 years old when they opened my chest. The surgery took 9 hours. The bill nearly destroyed my family. My mother, Karen, picked up double shifts at the school district office for years to pay it down. She never complained about it, at least not to me. My father, Robert Clark, handled it differently. He never forgot the number. And he never let me forget it either. I was 6 the first time he said it. I'd asked for a new pair of rain boots. Mine had a crack along the sole, and my socks got soaked through every time it rained. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of medical bills spread in front of him like a losing hand of cards. He didn't look up. He just said it. "Do you know how much you cost this family, Madison?" I stood in the doorway holding my wet socks. I was 6 years old. I didn't know what to say. So I said nothing. I didn't get the boots. By the time I was 10, I'd stopped asking for anything. Not shoes, not school supplies, not field trip money. I figured out early that every request came with a cost that had nothing to do with price tags. It came with his eyes, the way they'd narrow just slightly, the way his jaw would set before he answered, like he was calculating not just the dollars but the years of resentment behind them. By 13, I was babysitting 3 houses on our block every weekend to pay for my own supplies. By 18, I signed my first student loan alone at a folding table in the guidance counselor's office. While 2 miles away, my older sister Olivia was packing for the state university our parents were funding in full. Nobody at that table told me this was unusual. Nobody at home told me it was unfair. And I didn't question it, because in the Clark household there was a system, and the system had been in place so long it felt like gravity. You don't question gravity, you just live under it. Olivia got a car the day she turned 18. I rode the bus until I could afford a used Civic with 140,000 miles on it. Olivia got her tuition paid in full, books included. I got a repayment plan and a credit score that followed me for a decade. Olivia got birthday dinners at nice restaurants, the kind with cloth napkins and candles on the table. I got a boxed cake and a card signed only by my mother. When Olivia turned 25, my father co-signed a business loan so she could open her own real estate brokerage. He took her to lunch that day. He told her he was proud. When I turned 25, I'd just been promoted to assistant manager at the hotel. I called my father to tell him. He listened for about 15 seconds, then said, "That's nice, Madison. I hope it pays enough to cover your loans." And here's the part that's hardest to explain. I wasn't angry. I genuinely believed I owed them. My father had said it so many times, in so many ways, over so many years, that the debt felt as real as the scar on my chest. "This family has sacrificed too much for you already." That was his favorite version. He said it the way someone quotes scripture, like it was an undeniable truth carved into the foundation of our house. I carried that debt the way I carried my hotel badge every morning, clipped to my jacket without thinking, so familiar I forgot it was there. But there was one person who never mentioned the debt. Not once. Not a single time in my entire life. My grandfather, Harold Bennett. Harold lived alone in a 2-story wooden house on the outskirts of Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. Pine floors that creaked in exactly the same spots they'd creaked for 38 years, a kitchen table stained with decades of coffee rings, a porch swing that groaned when the wind pushed it and groaned louder when someone sat in it. He'd lived in that house since before my mother was born, raised her there, buried my grandmother Margaret from there, kept the vegetable garden alive through every winter since, even when his knees got bad, even when his hands started shaking, even when the doctor told him to take it easy and Harold told the doctor to mind his own business. I started visiting him every Saturday when I was 24. Fresh out of hospitality school, drowning in student debt, working double shifts at the hotel and still barely covering rent. I'd drive 45 minutes each way, bring him groceries, check his blood pressure with a cuff I'd learned to use from a first aid course, and then sit on that porch swing and listen to him talk. He talked about the weather, about the Phillies, about the neighbor's dog that kept digging up his tomatoes. He talked about my grandmother, about how she used to hum while she cooked, and how the house still smelled like her perfume sometimes when the windows were open just right. He never said, "You owe me." He never reminded me what I'd cost. He said things like, "Tell me about your week, sweetheart." He said, "Did you eat today?" He said, "Sit down, Madison, you look tired." He made scrambled eggs every Saturday morning whether I was hungry or not, and he didn't let me leave until I'd eaten at least one plate. The eggs were always slightly overcooked and always slightly undersalted, and they were the best thing I ate every single week. Harold watched my father carefully. I didn't realize it at the time, but he saw everything. He noticed when I showed up wearing shoes that were falling apart. He noticed when I flinched at the mention of money. He noticed when Olivia got a new car and I didn't get a phone call on my birthday. He never confronted my father directly. That was his regret, the one thing he'd later apologize for in a letter I wouldn't read until I was lying in a hospital bed wondering how I'd survived. But he watched, and he planned. Near the end, his hands shaking, his voice barely above a whisper, he told me something I didn't understand. We were sitting on the porch. The sun was going down. The swing was creaking in that slow rhythm that I can still hear when I close my eyes. He turned to me and said, "I've made sure you'll be okay, Maddie. When the time comes, find a man named Whitfield. He has everything you need." I smiled. I squeezed his hand. I thought it was the medication talking. He was 81. He got confused sometimes, or so I believed. I told myself it was nothing. I was wrong about that. Harold Bennett was sharp until his last breath. He remembered everything, including things my father desperately wished he'd forget. The name Whitfield meant nothing to me that evening. It would mean everything within a matter of weeks. My father hated that I visited Harold. "You're wasting gas," he'd say. "He doesn't even know what day it is." That was a lie. Harold knew exactly what day it was. He knew exactly what my father had been doing for years. And he'd been quietly, carefully, without telling a single soul, preparing for the day I'd need to fight back. Harold died on a Wednesday in April. Quietly. In that wooden house. In his sleep. I got the call at 6 a.m. I drove to Bryn Mawr in silence. No radio, no phone, nothing but the road and the sound of my own breathing. I parked in the gravel driveway and sat on the porch swing for an hour before anyone else arrived. The garden was just starting to come back from winter. His rosemary had survived again. It always survived. My father organized the funeral. Small, fast, efficient. He kept it to 45 minutes. He didn't let me speak. "Keep it short," he said at the door of the funeral home. "We're not making a production out of this." I stood in the back row and said goodbye in silence. I watched my father shake hands and accept condolences with the practiced ease of a man who'd been performing composure his entire life. I watched Olivia check her phone twice during the service. I watched the casket go into the ground, and I thought about the porch swing and the scrambled eggs and the way Harold always said my name like it was something worth saying. I didn't know what Harold had done for me. I didn't know about the will. I didn't know about the house or the trust fund or the letter he'd sealed in an envelope with just my name written across the front in his thin, steady handwriting. I didn't know that a man named Thomas Whitfield had been trying to reach me for months, and that my father had been blocking every attempt. I didn't know that in 4 weeks, my heart would betray me again, that I'd collapse in a conference room and wake up 3 weeks later in a hospital bed, alone. I didn't know that my father and my sister would stand in a hallway and agree, out loud, with a nurse standing 12 feet away, that my life was not worth the cost. I didn't know that while I lay unconscious, Robert Clark would forge my name, steal my grandfather's house, and mortgage it for $350,000 to cover debts he'd been hiding for years. All of that was coming. But first, Harold had to be buried, and my father had to find the envelope. The night of Harold's funeral, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed in my apartment staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle around me, thinking about the last Saturday I'd spent with him. He'd made eggs. He'd asked about my week. He'd said the thing about Whitfield, and I'd smiled and squeezed his hand like he was a sweet old man losing his grip on the present. I hated myself for that, for the smile, for the assumption, for every time I'd told myself he was confused when he was actually the sharpest person in the room. I replayed his words in the dark. "I've made sure you'll be okay, Maddie. When the time comes, find a man named Whitfield. He has everything you need." I didn't know who Whitfield was. I didn't know what Harold had arranged, but lying there in the dark, I felt something I couldn't name. Not grief, exactly. Grief, I understood. This was closer to the feeling you get when you realize someone left a door open for you and you walked right past it without looking. The funeral had been exactly what my father wanted. 45 minutes, no frills. A pastor who'd known Harold for 30 years was given 10 minutes to speak. My father shook hands at the door and accepted condolences with the steady, practiced expression of a man who understood that funerals were performances, and performances had run times. Olivia stood beside him in a black dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, tags probably still in the pocket. She hugged people she hadn't spoken to in years. She said, "He's at peace now," 4 times. I counted. I wasn't allowed to give a eulogy. I'd written one. 3 pages, handwritten on a yellow legal pad, about the porch swing and the scrambled eggs and the way Harold would call me sweetheart, like the word was invented specifically for Saturday mornings. I'd folded the pages into my jacket pocket and carried them to the funeral home. My father stopped me at the door. "Keep it short. We're not making a production." He didn't look at the pages. He didn't ask what I'd written. He simply made the decision, the way he'd made every decision my entire life, and expected me to comply. I put the pages back in my pocket. I stood in the back row. I said goodbye to my grandfather in silence while my father managed the room like it was one of his plumbing jobs. In, out, clean up, done. But something happened that night. Something I almost missed. After the service, after the last guests had left, my father drove to Harold's house. I know this because I was already there. I'd gone straight from the funeral home. I needed to sit on the porch swing one more time to be in Harold's space before it was emptied and cleaned and turned into just another property on a deed. I was sitting in the dark on the swing when headlights swept across the front yard. My father's truck pulled into the gravel driveway. He didn't see my car parked on the street. He walked up the side steps, used a key I didn't know he had, and went inside. I stayed on the swing. Through the window, I could see him moving through the house. Not slowly, not the way you move through a dead man's home when you're grieving. He moved with purpose. He went straight to Harold's study, the small room at the back of the house where Harold kept his desk, his files, his radio, and a lifetime of paperwork in a green metal filing cabinet. I watched my father open the cabinet. He rifled through folders. He pulled one out, then another. He held something up to the light, a thick envelope, cream-colored, the kind used for legal documents. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he slid it into his coat pocket, closed the cabinet, turned off the light, and walked out the same side door he'd come in. He didn't look at the porch. He didn't see me sitting there in the dark, watching him pocket something from a dead man's filing cabinet before the body was even cold. He got in his truck and drove away. I sat on the swing for another hour. I didn't know what was in that envelope. I wouldn't know for months. But I knew what I'd seen. My father taking something from Harold's house on the night of the funeral, quickly and quietly, like a man who'd been waiting for this exact opportunity. I should tell you about Daniel, because without Daniel, I wouldn't be telling this story. I'd be a footnote in a medical file and a name on a headstone. Daniel Reed, 36 years old, Director of Operations for an international hotel chain. We met at an industry conference in Chicago 3 years before any of this happened. I was managing a panel on guest experience strategy. He was in the audience, third row, taking notes on a leather-bound pad like someone who actually intended to use them. After the panel, he found me at the coffee station and said, "Your point about anticipatory service was the only useful thing anyone said today." I told him that was either a compliment to me or an insult to the other panelists. He said both. We dated for a year before he proposed. Simple, private, on the rooftop terrace of the hotel I managed, after hours, with the city lights doing most of the work. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Not because it was romantic, although it was, but because Daniel was the first person in my life besides Harold who made me feel like I wasn't a burden. He never calculated my cost. He never weighed my value against a spreadsheet. He just showed up consistently without conditions, and let me be the version of myself I'd never been allowed to be in my father's house. 3 years before my cardiac emergency, I signed a healthcare proxy designating Daniel as my legal medical decision-maker. I did it during our engagement at a lawyer's office on Broad Street, as part of a standard set of legal documents Daniel insisted we both complete. He was methodical about these things: insurance, wills, proxies, emergency contacts. He said it was just being responsible. I signed the papers and forgot about them. I never imagined they'd be the reason I survived. The week after Harold's funeral, Olivia called me. This wasn't unusual. Olivia called every few weeks, usually to tell me about a property she'd listed or a deal she'd closed or a client who'd tried to lowball her. She liked an audience for her victories. What was unusual was the question she asked. "Did Grandpa ever mention anything to you about the house? Any paperwork or legal stuff?" Her voice was casual. Too casual. The kind of casual that takes effort. I was driving home from work, stopped at a red light on Market Street. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "Dad's been going through Grandpa's things. He's trying to sort out the estate. He thinks there might be some documents that need handling." She paused. "I just wondered if Harold ever talked to you about it. You were there every Saturday." I thought about the porch swing, about Harold's whisper, about the name Whitfield, but something held me back. A feeling I couldn't quite name. "He never mentioned any paperwork to me," I said. "We mostly just talked about the garden and the fillies." Olivia exhaled. A relieved exhale, though I didn't recognize it as relief at the time. "Yeah, that sounds like Grandpa. Okay, no worries. Dad's got it handled." Then she said something that snagged in my memory like a thread catching on a nail. "Dad says the house should go back to the family. It shouldn't just go to one person, you know? That wouldn't be fair." She corrected herself immediately. "I mean, it's obviously a family decision. I'm sure Dad will figure out the right thing." But the first version was the real one. I'd worked in hospitality long enough to know that people tell you the truth in the sentence they try to take back. I didn't think much about it at the time. I was dealing with my own world. The hotel had just put me up for regional director, the biggest promotion of my career. 10 properties across the Northeast, a team of 200 people, a salary that would finally let me breathe without doing the math first. The interviews were scheduled for the following month. My general manager told me I was the frontrunner. For the first time in years, something in my life felt like it was moving forward instead of just holding steady. I told my father about the promotion during a Sunday phone call. He listened for 8 seconds. "Sounds like a lot of travel," he said. "Hope it's worth the stress." Then he changed the subject to a leak he'd fixed for a client. I held the phone away from my face and stared at it for a moment, the way you look at an object that keeps doing exactly what you expect and still somehow disappoints you. Then I put it back to my ear and said, "That's great, Dad." Because that's what I did. That's what I'd always done. Daniel took me to dinner that night to celebrate the nomination. A small Italian place in Rittenhouse Square, the kind with handwritten menus and a waiter who remembers your name. He raised his glass and said, "You earned this." 2 words. He said them like facts, not favors, like they were obvious. I almost cried at the table, and I didn't even fully understand why. I think it was because no one in my family had ever said those words to me without attaching a cost. The weeks after Harold's death moved quickly. I threw myself into work. I prepared for the regional director interviews. I visited Harold's house twice more on Saturdays, out of habit, sitting on the porch swing in the empty quiet, pulling weeds from the garden because it felt wrong to let them grow over what he'd built. Each time, I noticed things missing. A shelf that had been full was now half empty. A drawer in the study that used to stick was now slightly open, as if someone had been through it recently and hadn't pushed it all the way closed. The green filing cabinet in the back room was unlocked. Harold always kept it locked. I told myself it was my father handling the estate, sorting through paperwork, doing what families do when someone dies. I didn't question it. I'd spent my whole life not questioning Robert Clark's decisions, and the habit ran deeper than I wanted to admit. But something was happening beneath the surface of my family that I couldn't see. My father was carrying a secret that had been eating at him for 3 years, a financial disaster he'd hidden from everyone, a debt so large it had reshaped his entire life without anyone noticing. Olivia wasn't just asking me casual questions about Harold's paperwork, she was gathering intelligence, and the envelope my father had taken from Harold's study on the night of the funeral contained information that would set everything in motion: the will, the house, the name Thomas Whitfield, and the quiet, devastating proof that Harold had never trusted his son-in-law with anything that mattered. I didn't know any of this. Not yet. I was 33 years old, preparing for the biggest interview of my career, visiting a dead man's garden on Saturdays, and carrying a scar on my chest from a surgery that happened before I could remember. I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. I thought the debt my father hung over my head was the worst thing he'd ever do. I was wrong about that. In 4 weeks, my heart would stop in the middle of a conference room, and the people who were supposed to save me would do the math instead. The morning it happened, I felt fine. That's what I keep coming back to. I felt completely, unremarkably fine. I woke up at 5:30, same as every day. Showered. Coffee. A banana on the way out the door because I didn't have time for anything else. I drove to the hotel in the half-dark of an early May morning, parked in my usual spot on the 3rd floor of the garage, and walked through the lobby checking the floor tiles, the flower arrangements, the temperature of the air, all the invisible things guests never notice unless they're wrong. That was my job, making sure nothing was wrong, making sure everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. By 9 a.m., I was in the executive conference room on the 12th floor, a meeting with the regional board about the director nomination. 4 people around a long table, laptop open, presentation loaded. I was walking them through the 3rd quarter performance metrics for our property when the room shifted. Not the people, the room itself. The edges of my vision went soft, like someone had smeared petroleum jelly on the corners of my glasses. The numbers on the screen blurred. I felt a pressure in my chest, not pain exactly, more like someone pressing a fist against my sternum from the inside, steady and firm and growing. I stopped talking. I remember one of the board members, a woman named Patricia, looking up from her notes with her pen frozen in midair. I remember wanting to say, "I'm fine," because that's what I always said, in every situation, to every person, my whole life. "I'm fine. I owe you nothing. I cost you nothing. I'm fine." I didn't say it. My knees buckled. The carpet came up to meet me. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the ceiling of the conference room, the recessed lights, the small brown water stain in the corner that facilities had been meaning to fix for 2 months. Then nothing. They told me later that Patricia called 911 within 15 seconds, that the paramedics were in the building within 7 minutes, that my heart had gone into an arrhythmia caused by a complication from the original defect, the one they'd repaired when I was 2 years old. 31 years later, the fix had started to fail. The doctors at St. Elizabeth's, the hospital 3 blocks from my hotel, identified the problem within the hour. Emergency cardiac surgery, open chest, immediate. But someone had to authorize it. I had no husband, no children. My emergency contact at the hotel was listed as my father, Robert Clark, because he'd insisted on it when I first took the job and I'd never changed it. The hospital pulled my records, found his number, and called him at 8:47 p.m. He arrived at 9:15. The front desk logged it. What happened next I learned from a woman named Sandra Nguyen. Sandra was the charge nurse on the cardiac floor that night. She'd been at St. Elizabeth's for 12 years, calm, precise, the kind of nurse who documents everything because she learned early in her career that memory is unreliable but paper holds up in court. Sandra was at the nursing station, 15 feet from the financial counselor's window, when my father walked in. He didn't go to my room first. He didn't ask which floor I was on. He didn't ask if I was conscious, if I was in pain, if I was afraid. He walked straight to the financial counselor's window and asked one question. How much is this going to cost? The counselor paged Dr. Marcus Webb, the cardiothoracic surgeon managing my case. Dr. Webb came down and explained the situation. Emergency surgery. The defect had caused a structural failure in the ventricular wall. Without intervention, I would die. The estimated cost, after insurance, was between $200,000 and $240,000, depending on complications and ICU recovery time. My father listened. He didn't sit down. He stood with his arms crossed and his weight shifted to one side, the posture of a man evaluating a contractor's estimate, not a surgeon's prognosis. He asked about payment plans. He asked about his financial liability as an emergency contact. He asked whether declining treatment would result in any charges to the family. Dr. Webb answered each question carefully. Sandra told me later that Webb's voice got quieter with each answer, the way a doctor's voice drops when he realizes he's not talking to a father anymore, but to an accountant. Then Olivia arrived. 9:45 p.m. She came through the main entrance in a gray coat, phone in hand, walking fast. She didn't stop at the information desk. She didn't ask for my room number. She found my father in the waiting area outside the surgical wing, sitting in a plastic chair with his coat still on. She sat down beside him. Sandra was restocking a supply cart 12 feet away, close enough to hear every word. "What did they say?" Olivia asked. Robert told her. The surgery, the timeline, the cost. Olivia listened. She looked at the floor. She looked at the ceiling. Then she turned to our father and said it. Clear, steady, without lowering her voice, without checking to see if anyone was listening. "Let her die. We won't pay for the surgery. Think about what that money could do for us." Sandra's hand stopped on the supply cart. She told me later she gripped the edge of the shelf so hard the metal cut into her palm. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She watched. My father looked at Olivia. 5 seconds passed. Maybe 6. He didn't argue. He didn't say, "We can't do that," or "She's my daughter," or "Let me think." He nodded. One slow nod. The kind that says, "I agree," and I was already thinking it. They stood up together. Olivia adjusted her coat. Robert picked up the folder the financial counselor had given him, the one with the treatment authorization form inside it, the form that only needed a signature to save my life. He carried it to the nurse's station. He set it on the counter, unsigned, and said to the clerk, "We're declining the procedure. We won't be authorizing surgery." Then he turned and walked toward the elevator. Olivia followed. They left the building at 9:52 p.m. Sandra logged it at 9:55. They didn't visit my room. They didn't look through the glass. They didn't say goodbye. I was lying 14 feet away, unconscious, with a heart that was failing, and a family that had just decided I wasn't worth the bill. Sandra stood behind the nursing station for a long time after they left. She told me her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She wanted to scream. She wanted to chase them down the hallway. She didn't. She did something better. Sandra sat down at the station computer and opened the hospital's linked employee network. St. Elizabeth's was part of the same healthcare system that partnered with my hotel for corporate wellness programs. My employee records were accessible through the shared network, including my emergency medical documents. Sandra scrolled through the file. Contact information, insurance, allergies. And at the bottom, a section most people skip. Healthcare proxy designation. The name on the form was Daniel Reed, fiancé. His phone number was listed, his address. The proxy authorization was clear, notarized, and legally binding. Sandra picked up the phone. It was 10:22 p.m. in Philadelphia, 4:22 a.m. in Paris, where Daniel was on the third day of a business trip negotiating a hotel acquisition. He answered on the second ring. Sandra told him everything. The cardiac emergency, the surgery, the family that had walked out, the unsigned consent form. Daniel didn't ask her to repeat anything. He didn't ask clarifying questions. He said, "I authorize the surgery. Do whatever needs to be done. I'm coming home." Sandra transferred him to Dr. Webb. Daniel gave verbal authorization over the phone, confirmed by his proxy documentation in the system. Webb accepted it. The surgical team began prepping. Daniel hung up, packed his suitcase, and was at Charles de Gaulle Airport within the hour. He boarded the first available flight. 14 hours later, he walked into St. Elizabeth's, unshaven, wrinkled, carrying a suitcase, and a look on his face that Sandra described as the quietest kind of fury she'd ever seen. He signed the consent form in person. He asked the hospital's legal team to create a formal record documenting the family's refusal to authorize treatment. Then he sat down in the vinyl chair beside my bed and didn't leave. My father was home by then, sleeping. He had no idea the surgery had been authorized. As far as he knew, the machines would stop, the hospital would call him in the morning, and the whole thing would be over. One less bill, one less burden, one less daughter who'd been costing him money since before she could walk. Sandra did one more thing before her shift ended. She opened an internal incident report, the kind filed when a staff member witnesses a protocol concern. She documented every word my father and sister had said. The timestamps, the names, Olivia's exact words, Robert's nod, the unsigned form, the departure time. She filed the report, locked her computer, and sat alone in the break room for 15 minutes. Robert Clark went home that night, believing his daughter would be dead by morning. He slept well, and when he woke up the next day, he didn't call the hospital. He didn't drive over to check. Instead, he pulled an envelope from his coat pocket, the one he'd taken from Harold's study, and started making plans for the house that now, as far as he was concerned, had no one left to claim it. He didn't know I was still alive. He didn't know that a nurse had found a document he'd never thought to look for, that a man had flown across an ocean to sign a piece of paper he'd never considered, and that in 3 weeks I would open my eyes and begin to dismantle everything he'd built. He had no idea. And that was his first mistake. Sandra Nguyen made the call at 10:22 p.m. Philadelphia time. It was 4:22 in the morning in Paris. Daniel was on the third floor of a hotel near the Champs-Élysées, sitting at a small desk in his room, reviewing acquisition documents for a property his company was negotiating to purchase. He'd been working since midnight because the time difference made it easier to handle U.S. correspondence in the early hours. His phone was on the desk beside his laptop, screen down, the way he always kept it when he was concentrating. When it buzzed, he almost didn't pick up. The number was American, but not one he recognized. He answered anyway because something about a call at 4 a.m. from a number you don't know always demands an answer. "Mr. Reed, my name is Sandra Nguyen. I'm the charge nurse on the cardiac floor at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Philadelphia. I'm calling about Madison Clark." Daniel told me later that the first thing he felt wasn't fear. It was a sudden, absolute stillness, like the air in the room had been replaced with something heavier. He said he knew before Sandra finished her next sentence that whatever was coming would divide his life into before and after. Sandra explained it clearly, the way she explained everything, with the precision of someone who understands that in a crisis, ambiguity kills. Madison had suffered a cardiac emergency, a structural failure related to a congenital defect repaired in childhood. She was unconscious, intubated, in critical condition. Emergency surgery was required. Without it, she would die. The estimated cost after insurance was over $200,000. Then Sandra told him the rest. Madison's father, Robert Clark, had been contacted as the emergency contact on file. He had come to the hospital. He had spoken with the surgeon. He had been informed of the cost. He had not signed the consent form. He had left the hospital with Madison's sister, Olivia. Neither of them had authorized the surgery. Neither of them had returned. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Sandra waited. She'd learned that silence after bad news isn't emptiness. It's the sound of someone rearranging the architecture of their understanding. "I'm her healthcare proxy," Daniel said. His voice was steady. Sandra told me it was the steadiest voice she'd ever heard from a family member receiving that kind of call. "I know," she said. "I found your designation in her employee medical records. That's why I'm calling you." "I authorize the surgery," Daniel said. "Do whatever needs to be done. I'll confirm in person. I'm coming home." He didn't ask about the cost. He didn't ask about payment plans. He didn't ask whether declining would reduce his financial exposure. He said, "Do whatever needs to be done, the way you say something that isn't a decision, because the answer was never in question." Sandra transferred him to Dr. Webb. Daniel confirmed his identity, his proxy authorization, and his consent for the emergency procedure. Webb's team began prepping the surgical suite. Daniel hung up, closed his laptop, and packed his suitcase. He told me he didn't rush. He said rushing would have meant panic, and panic was something he couldn't afford. He folded his shirts. He zipped his bag. He called the airline and booked the first available flight. He left a note for his business partner explaining that a family emergency required his immediate return. He was at Charles de Gaulle Airport by 6 a.m. Paris time. The flight was 9 hours. Daniel sat in seat 14C coach because first class was full and he didn't care. He told me he spent the first 2 hours staring at the seat back in front of him, running the numbers. Not the money, the time. How long since Madison collapsed? How long since the surgery was authorized? How long the operation would take? How long until he could walk into that hospital and see her face? He spent the next 3 hours thinking about Robert, about a man who'd stood in a hospital corridor, heard that his daughter would die without surgery, and walked away. Daniel had met Robert exactly 4 times. Thanksgiving dinner the first year we were together. A brief, uncomfortable lunch when we announced our engagement, during which Robert spent most of the time talking about a plumbing contract and didn't congratulate us once. A phone call on my birthday that lasted 2 minutes, and a Christmas gathering where Robert shook Daniel's hand without making eye contact and spent the evening telling church friends about Olivia's real estate success. Daniel had never said anything negative about my father to me. That wasn't his way. But he told me later, on that plane somewhere over the Atlantic, he finally let himself think what he'd been holding back for 3 years. That Robert Clark wasn't just neglectful. He was dangerous. That the system I'd grown up in wasn't just unfair, it was designed to keep me small. And that the man who'd raised me had spent 33 years turning his youngest daughter into someone who believed she deserved nothing, so that when the moment came to let her die, it would feel like arithmetic instead of murder. Daniel landed at Philadelphia International at 2:15 p.m. Eastern Time, 14 hours after Sandra's call. He didn't go home, he didn't shower. He took a cab straight from the terminal to St. Elizabeth's. He walked through the front entrance carrying his suitcase, wearing the same clothes he'd put on in Paris, with stubble that had crossed the line into a short beard and eyes that were red-rimmed but absolutely focused. He went to the cardiac floor. Sandra met him at the nursing station. She told him the surgery had been completed 6 hours earlier. It had gone well. I was stable but still unconscious. and the doctors expected I would remain in a medically induced coma for an extended period while the swelling and trauma resolved. She walked him to my room. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at me, at the tubes, at the monitors, at the bruising along my arms where the IVs had been placed, at the bandage across my chest. Then he walked in, set his suitcase under the chair, sat down, and took my hand. He held it carefully, mindful of the IV line, the way you hold something that is broken and precious and yours. He didn't leave, not that day, not the next, not for 3 weeks. He slept in that vinyl chair every night. He ate from the hospital cafeteria. He answered work emails from his phone when he had to and ignored them when he didn't. His company's HR department sent a formal leave approval within 24 hours. His business partner in Paris handled the acquisition without him. The world kept turning, and Daniel sat in a chair beside my bed and waited for me to open my eyes. Sandra checked on him every shift. She brought him coffee. She updated him on my vitals. They developed the kind of bond that forms between people who are both waiting for the same person to wake up, the quiet solidarity of a shared vigil. During one of these conversations, late on a Tuesday night, Sandra mentioned something that made Daniel set down his coffee cup and stare at her. "Your fiancé's father called the hospital today," Sandra said. Daniel looked up. "He asked about Madison?" Sandra shook her head slowly. "He asked when he could pick up her personal belongings. The hospital is networked with her hotel's corporate wellness system. Her employee file is flagged here. He called the main line and asked about collecting her things from the staff records." Daniel was quiet for 10 seconds. Sandra watched his jaw tighten, then release, then tighten again. "He thinks she's dead," Daniel said. Sandra, "That's my assessment." Daniel, "And instead of calling to confirm, he's calling to collect her belongings." Sandra didn't answer. She didn't need to. Daniel reached into his wallet that night after Sandra left. He pulled out a business card, worn at the edges, slightly bent from being carried for 2 years. Harold Bennett had given it to him during one of my Saturday visits. Daniel had driven me to Bryn Mawr that day, and while I was inside making Harold's lunch, Harold had walked out to the porch where Daniel was sitting. Harold had pressed the card into his hand without a word, then looked him in the eye and said, "Keep this. You might need it someday. And when that day comes, let Maddie decide. It should be her choice." The card read, "Thomas Whitfield, attorney at law." Daniel looked at it for a long time that night. Then he put it back in his wallet and said nothing, because I hadn't asked yet, and Harold had told him to let me decide. So he waited, the way he waited for everything, patiently, steadily, without condition, the way he'd waited in that chair for 3 weeks, the way he'd wait for as long as it took. I didn't learn any of this until weeks later. What I'm about to tell you happened while I was unconscious, while the machines breathed for me and the monitors tracked my heartbeat, and Daniel held my hand through the long, silent hours. I pieced it together from documents, from court records, from things Whitfield told me and Sandra confirmed, and bank statements proved. But this is what happened. This is what my father did while I was lying in that bed. Robert Clark woke up the morning after leaving the hospital expecting a phone call. He'd rehearsed for it. I know this because it's exactly the kind of thing Robert does. He prepares his performance before the curtain goes up. He'd already composed the version he'd tell people, the catch in his voice, the slow exhale. We lost her. Her heart just wasn't strong enough. The doctors did everything they could. He'd deliver it at church. He'd deliver it to neighbors. He'd accept the casseroles and the sympathy cards and the firm handshakes from men who'd tell him they were sorry for his loss, and he'd nod with the weary dignity of a father who'd been through the unimaginable. But the call didn't come. Not at 7, not at 8, not at 9, not at 10. The hospital didn't call because I wasn't dead. The surgery had been completed. My vitals were stable. There was no death to report. But Robert didn't know that. He didn't call the hospital to ask. He didn't drive over to check. He interpreted the silence as bureaucratic delay, paperwork, processing. He assumed the notification would come eventually, and in the meantime, he had things to do. He sat at his kitchen table that Thursday morning with the envelope he'd taken from Harold's study. He'd opened it fully now, spread the contents across the table like a man reading a map. Inside was a copy of Harold's deed to the Bryn Mawr property, notes about a trust account, and a letter addressed to Thomas Whitfield, attorney at law, referencing a last will and testament filed on behalf of Harold James Bennett. Robert read the letter twice. His jaw tightened. Harold had left the house to Madison, not to the family, not to Karen, not split between the grandchildren, solely to Madison Marie Clark. The house, the land, and a trust account containing $120,000. All of it. To the daughter Robert had spent 33 years calling a financial burden. Robert set the letter down. He picked up his phone and called Olivia. She answered on the first ring, the way she always did when Robert called, because in the Clark family, when the patriarch summoned, you responded. "We have a problem," Robert said, "but it's a problem I can fix if she's not alive to claim it." Olivia didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. She'd been standing in the hospital waiting room 12 hours earlier and said, "Let her die," without flinching. She understood the arithmetic. She always had. Here is what Robert Clark did over the next 7 days. I'm going to lay it out step by step, the way Whitfield laid it out for me in my hospital room, the way it was later presented to the county court and the police and the fraud department at the bank. I'm going to tell you exactly how my father stole my grandfather's house while I was in a coma, because the precision of it matters. The planning matters. This wasn't a desperate act. This was methodical. Robert had kept copies of my medical consent forms from when I was 18. He'd insisted I sign a stack of documents that year: insurance authorizations, hospital pre-approvals, emergency contact designations. He told me it was standard. It was a lot of paperwork for an 18-year-old who didn't know better and trusted her father because she didn't yet understand that trust could be a tool for someone else's benefit. Those signatures, my signatures, had been in his filing cabinet for 15 years. Now he used them as templates. He sat at his desk on Thursday evening and practiced my handwriting. I don't know how long it took. I don't know if his hand shook. What I know is that by Friday morning, he had produced a power of attorney document with my signature on it, a signature I never wrote, authorizing Robert J. Clark to act on behalf of Madison Marie Clark in all matters related to property, finance, and estate management. He drove to a small office park off Route 30 in Malvern, a place called Valley Document Services. The man who ran it was named Victor Hale. Victor operated a notary and document preparation business from a ground-floor suite with blinds that were always half closed and a parking lot that was always half empty. Victor was not just a notary. He was Robert's former business partner. 3 years earlier, they'd been involved in a commercial real estate investment together, a deal that went bad in ways I'll explain shortly. Victor owed Robert money. More importantly, Robert knew things about Victor's tax filings, things involving unreported income and creative deductions, things that Victor very much did not want examined by anyone with a badge or a subpoena. Robert walked into Victor's office with the forged power of attorney. Victor looked at it. He didn't ask where Madison was. He didn't ask why she hadn't come in person. He didn't verify the signature against any known sample. He didn't call the number on the form to confirm identity. He stamped it. He signed it. He affixed his notary seal. He filed the copy and handed the original back to Robert. The entire visit took 11 minutes. I know this because Victor's office had a sign-in log that was later subpoenaed, and Victor, when he eventually cooperated with investigators, remembered the visit in detail. He said Robert was calm, businesslike. He said Robert thanked him and shook his hand on the way out, like closing a deal. Robert drove from Victor's office to the county recorder's office that same afternoon. He filed the deed transfer from Madison Marie Clark to Robert J. Clark, supported by the notarized power of attorney. The clerk processed it without question. The paperwork was in order. The notary seal was legitimate. The signature was not, but nobody checks a signature at the counter when the seal looks right, and the man filing it wears a clean shirt, and speaks with confidence. By Friday evening, Harold's house was in Robert's name. By Monday, Robert walked into a regional bank with the new deed and applied for a home equity loan. $350,000. The loan officer ran the title search. Clean. No liens, no disputes, no flags. Robert signed the loan documents. The bank approved the application. Within 6 business days, $350,000 was deposited into Robert J. Clark's personal checking account. The money did not go toward my medical bills. The money did not go into a savings account. The money did not go toward Harold's funeral costs or estate taxes, or anything remotely connected to the family Robert claimed to have sacrificed so much for. The money went to pay off debts that nobody in our family, our church, or our neighborhood knew existed. 3 years before any of this happened, Robert had invested nearly everything he had into a commercial plaza development in Chester County. The project was run by a developer named Glenn Archer. Polished presentations, projected returns of 20%, a timeline that promised completion in 18 months. Robert attended 2 meetings, read the prospectus, and wrote a check for everything in his retirement account. Then he borrowed more. Then he borrowed against his own house. Then he convinced Victor Hale to invest alongside him, which is how Victor ended up owing Robert favors he could never repay with cash. The project collapsed. Glenn Archer disappeared. The site sat half-built behind chain-link fencing and orange construction tape on a county road that nobody drove down unless they were lost. Robert lost over $400,000. He told no one, not my mother, not Olivia, not the men at church he ate breakfast with every Saturday, not Pastor Michael, who called Robert a man of integrity in sermons. He carried the loss silently, the way he carried everything, behind a mask of competence and control that he never let crack in public. To cover the loss and keep up the payments on his own mortgage, Robert had started draining Harold's accounts years before Harold died. Forged checks, small at first, 200 here, 500 there, then larger, 3,000, 5,000, 8,000. He redirected a portion of Harold's pension payments to an account Harold didn't recognize, an account Robert had opened using Harold's social security number and a mailing address that routed statements to a P.O. box Robert controlled. Harold noticed. Harold noticed every single one. But Harold didn't confront Robert. That was his deepest regret, and he said so in the letter he left me. He noticed the discrepancies, tracked the amounts, collected the evidence, and said nothing, because he believed that confronting Robert would destroy the family, would break Karen's heart, would force everyone to choose sides. So instead of speaking, Harold acted. He called a lawyer named Whitfield. He built a case. He made a will. He transferred the house. He prepared a USB drive with 5 years of documentation. And he wrote me a letter that began with the words, "Don't make my mistake." The $350,000 from the mortgage went fast. $240,000 went to outstanding debts, construction liens, personal loans, a second mortgage payment on Robert's own house that was 3 months overdue. Creditors who had been calling Robert's phone at all hours suddenly stopped. Bills that had been piling up on his kitchen table disappeared. The pressure that had been building for 3 years released like a valve opening. The remaining $110,000 went to Olivia. This is the part that still sits in my chest like a stone when I think about it. My father called Olivia the morning after the deed transfer. He told her what he'd done. The forged POA. The house. The mortgage. He didn't ask for her permission. He offered her a cut. $110,000. Enough to fund the expansion she'd been planning for over a year, a second office for her real estate brokerage in King of Prussia, a growing market with wealthy clients and high commissions. Olivia took the money. She took it on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, she'd signed a lease on the new office space. She didn't ask where the money came from, or rather, she knew exactly where it came from, and decided that knowing wasn't the same as asking, and not asking wasn't the same as being guilty. She told herself it was practical. Madison was in a coma, probably dying. The house would sit empty. The money would disappear into probate. Someone needed to act, and acting meant the brokerage could expand, the business could grow, and Olivia's name could be on 2 doors instead of 1. She called it efficiency. She called it being smart. She called it family, looking out for family. She called it everything except what it was, which was taking money from a stolen house while her sister lay unconscious in a hospital bed that their father had walked away from. That night, Olivia sent Robert a text message from her new office. 5 words. "Make sure the paperwork is clean. I don't want any of this coming back to me." Robert read it. He didn't reply. They understood each other perfectly. They always had. They were 2 people operating from the same playbook, the one that said Madison's value was a number, and the number didn't add up. Robert didn't know that the house was already in my name before he forged the transfer. He didn't know that Harold's will had been probated months earlier. He didn't know that Thomas Whitfield had been trying to reach me and that Robert's own interception of those calls was documented. He didn't know about the USB drive Harold had left with Whitfield, a drive containing 5 years of forged checks, bank records, pension redirects, and an email exchange between Robert and Victor Hale that included the sentence, "If the granddaughter finds out about the accounts, we're done." And he certainly didn't know about the vinyl chair on the cardiac floor, the one where Daniel Reed sat every day, holding my hand, waiting for me to open my eyes, carrying in his wallet a business card that Harold Bennett had given him with the quiet instruction, "When the day comes, let Maddie decide." Robert slept well that week. He slept the way a man sleeps when he believes all the evidence is buried, all the witnesses are silent, and the only person who could hold him accountable is never going to wake up. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about all of it. And 3 weeks later, when I opened my eyes in that hospital bed and saw Daniel's face instead of my father's, the first thread of Robert Clark's carefully constructed world began to pull loose. He just didn't know it yet. I opened my eyes on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the conference room, 3 weeks after the carpet came up to meet me and the ceiling lights faded to black. The first thing I registered wasn't sight, it was sound. A steady beeping, rhythmic and mechanical, the heartbeat of a machine pretending to be mine. Then the light came, blue-white and flat, the kind that only exists in hospitals. No warmth in it. No texture. Just brightness pressed against everything like a weight. I knew that light. I'd walked past it 1,000 times in the corridors that connected my hotel to the medical campus across the street. But I'd never been under it like this. I'd never been the one lying down. My throat was raw. The breathing tube had been removed days earlier, but the ghost of it sat in my chest like a bruise I couldn't see. My ribs ached with every inhale. My left arm was wrapped in a soft brace. Everything felt heavy, my limbs, my eyelids, even my thoughts, like they were moving through water instead of air. I tried to lift my right hand, and it took more effort than I expected, the kind of effort that makes you aware of muscles you've never thought about. The first face I saw was Daniel's, not my father's, not Olivia's, not my mother's. Daniel. He was sitting in a chair beside my bed, a vinyl chair with chrome legs that looked like it had been pulled from a waiting room. His shirt was wrinkled. His jaw was covered in a short beard I'd never seen on him before. There were shadows under his eyes so deep they looked like bruises. A paper coffee cup sat on the floor beside him, half finished and cold. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in his own bed for a very long time. When he saw my eyes open, he didn't gasp. He didn't shout for a nurse. He didn't jump up and press the call button. He leaned forward slowly, took my hand, his fingers careful around the IV line, and he said, "Hey, you're safe. I'm here." His voice cracked on the last word. Just barely. Just enough for me to hear the 3 weeks of waiting behind it. I tried to speak. My voice came out as a scrape, barely a whisper, like someone dragging a chair across a floor. "How long?" Daniel's thumb moved across the back of my hand. 3 weeks. "The surgery went well. You're going to be okay." I closed my eyes. Not because I was tired, although I was tired in a way I'd never experienced, a tiredness that went past muscles and into bone. I closed my eyes because I was trying to reassemble the last thing I remembered. The conference room, the presentation, the numbers on the screen going blurry. Patricia's pen frozen in midair, the floor rising. I opened my eyes again. I looked at Daniel. I looked at the chair, at the wrinkled shirt, at the beard, at the evidence of weeks spent in a room that wasn't his. And I asked the question that had already begun to form itself the moment I realized he was the only person in the room. "Where's my dad?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. His hand stayed on mine. His eyes didn't move from my face, but something shifted in his expression, a tightening around the jaw, a flicker of something he was deciding whether to show me or hold back. That pause, those 3 seconds of silence, told me more than any answer could have. Something was wrong. Something beyond the hospital and the surgery and the 3 weeks I couldn't remember. "There are things I need to tell you," he said. "Not all at once, but you need to know." I looked at him. "Tell me." He took a breath. "Your dad came to the hospital the night it happened. He spoke with Dr. Webb about the surgery. He was told the cost. He didn't sign the consent form. He left the hospital without authorizing the procedure." I stared at the ceiling. I counted the tiles above my bed. 1, 2, 3. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask him to slow down or repeat himself. I lay still and let the information enter my body, the way the IV drip entered my arm, slowly, steadily, cold. "He wasn't alone," Daniel continued. His voice was even, controlled, but I could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "Olivia was there. She came to the hospital and found your father in the waiting area. Sandra Nguyen, the charge nurse on the floor that night, was standing 12 feet away. She heard everything." Another pause. Longer this time. Daniel was looking at our hands, at his fingers laced through mine. "What did Olivia say?" I asked. "She said, 'Let her die. We won't pay for the surgery. Think about what that money could do for us.'" The monitor beeped, once, twice, 3 times. I lay perfectly still. Not because I was shocked, because I was experiencing something I'd never felt before and didn't have a word for. It was the sensation of hearing, spoken aloud, in clear language. The thing you've always known but never had the courage or the cruelty to articulate. My sister had said out loud what my father had been saying with his silence, his calculations, his resentment. For 33 years. I was a cost. I had always been a cost. And when the final invoice arrived, they decided I wasn't worth paying. "Your father nodded," Daniel said. "They stood up. They walked out together. Neither of them signed. Neither of them came back." He waited. He gave me space to react, to cry, to scream, to do whatever I needed to do. I didn't do any of those things. I lay there and breathed and counted the beeps and let the truth settle into the place where it belonged, alongside the scar on my chest and the debt I'd been carrying since I was 6 years old. "How am I alive?" I asked. "Sandra found your healthcare proxy in the hospital system. She called me in Paris. I authorized the surgery by phone and flew back to sign in person. I asked the hospital legal team to document the family's refusal to authorize treatment." "He didn't come back at all?" "Not once. No phone call, no visit, nothing." Daniel paused again. "Until 4 days ago." I turned my head on the pillow and looked at him. "What happened 4 days ago?" "He called the hospital, but not to ask about you. He called to ask when he could collect your personal belongings from the staff record system." The room was quiet. The beeping continued. I understood what that meant. My father had called to collect a dead woman's things. He thought I was gone. He wasn't grieving, he was cleaning up. "I need to see Sandra," I said. Daniel nodded. He stepped out. 20 minutes later, Sandra Nguyen walked into my room. She was exactly as I'd imagined from Daniel's descriptions. Mid-40s, hair pulled back tight, scrubs that had seen a full shift, a face that carried the particular calm of someone who has delivered every kind of news a hospital can produce, and has learned that composure isn't coldness, but a form of care. She pulled a chair to my bedside and sat down. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She knew how I was feeling. She'd been watching my vitals for 3 weeks. "I want to hear it from you," I said. "Everything," Sandra told me. She laid it out the way she'd written it in her report, the way she'd type it into the incident log, with timestamps and precision and no editorializing. Robert arrived at 9:15 p.m., went directly to the financial counselor's window, did not ask about my condition, did not ask which room I was in. Dr. Webb came to discuss the case. Robert asked about the cost. Robert asked about his liability. Robert asked about what would happen financially if he declined treatment for his daughter. Olivia arrived at 9:45. She found Robert in the waiting area. Sandra was restocking a supply cart 12 feet away. Olivia asked what the doctors said. Robert told her. Olivia processed the information for approximately 10 seconds. Then she delivered her verdict. "Let her die. We won't pay for the surgery. Think about what that money could do for us." Robert looked at Olivia for 5 seconds. He nodded. They stood up. They left the building at 9:52. Sandra logged it at 9:55. Sandra paused. Then she added something Daniel hadn't told me. "4 days ago, your father called the hospital's main line. He asked about collecting your personal belongings from the employee network. He spoke as if you were already gone. He used past tense. He said, 'My daughter's things,' the way someone says, 'the previous tenant's mail.'" I took the call. I recognized his voice from that night. I looked at her. "Is the incident report on file?" "Filed, time-stamped, and locked in the system. Every word, both names, exact times." "Thank you, Sandra." She didn't say, "You're welcome." She looked at me steadily and said, "I would have called Daniel even if I hadn't found the proxy. I want you to know that." She stood up. She straightened her scrubs. She walked to the door. Then she stopped and turned back. "Your grandfather came to this hospital once, about a year before he died." I stared at her. "He asked to speak with the charge nurse on the cardiac floor. He sat in that chair," she pointed to the visitor's chair by the window, "and he asked me to keep an eye on you. He said, if anything ever happens to Maddie, her family won't help. But someone here will." She held my gaze for a moment. He was right. Then she left. I lay in the bed staring at the chair she'd pointed to. Harold. Even here, even in this. A year before he died, he'd walked into this hospital and planted a seed. He'd asked a stranger to watch over me because he knew, with the certainty of a man who'd been watching for decades, that when the worst came, his own family would fail me. He didn't trust them. He trusted a nurse he'd never met, a lawyer I'd never heard of, and a system he'd built piece by piece, quietly, invisibly, while I sat on his porch swing every Saturday thinking he was just a sweet old man who liked scrambled eggs. My father showed up at 2:17 that afternoon. The nurses logged it. He walked in carrying yellow tulips and a small Tupperware container of lemon bars that Olivia had apparently baked. He set them on the bedside table, leaned down, kissed my forehead, and sat in the chair with the heavy sigh of a man carrying an enormous burden. He was good at this. The performance. I'd watched it my entire life, at parent-teacher nights, at church fundraisers, at holiday dinners, the weary father, the quiet provider, the man who gave everything and never asked for thanks. "The doctors say you'll be out in a week or two," he said, squeezing my hand. "We were so worried, sweetheart. I've barely slept." I looked at his eyes. They were clear, well-rested. No bags, no redness, no sign of a man who'd spent 3 weeks pacing a hallway or sleeping in a chair. His shirt was ironed. His hair was combed. He looked like a man who'd been sleeping 8 hours a night in his own bed, because he had been. "Thanks for coming, Dad," I said. I said it the way you say it when you know exactly who you're talking to and you're choosing, deliberately, to let them believe you don't. Olivia didn't come. She sent a text. "So relieved you're okay. We'll visit soon. Love you." She never visited. Not the next day, not the day after, not once during my remaining stay. The "soon" in her message was the kind of word people use when they have no intention of following through but want it on record that they said something kind. Before Robert left, He paused at the door. His voice shifted to casual, the kind of casual I'd heard 1,000 times from hotel guests who were about to dispute a charge they knew was valid. "Oh, by the way, Grandpa Harold's estate, the house and all that. I've been sorting through it. Paperwork, you know how it is. Don't worry about any of it, I'll handle everything." He watched my face as he said it. I felt the scan. The way his eyes moved across my expression, looking for a crack, a flinch, a sign that I knew something I shouldn't. I'd spent 11 years managing. He watched my face as he said it. I felt the scan. The way his eyes moved across my expression, looking for a crack, a flinch, a sign that I knew something I shouldn't. I'd spent 11 years managing luxury hotels. I could read a guest's intention from across a lobby. I could tell when someone was lying about a noise complaint, fabricating a billing dispute, or testing whether I'd bend on a policy. My father was doing the same thing. He was checking the perimeter. I gave him nothing. I smiled. "Thanks, Dad. I really appreciate you taking care of that." He smiled back, satisfied. He picked up his coat, patted my hand, and walked out. He didn't look back. The door closed. I counted to 10. The room was silent except for the heart monitor. I turned to Daniel, who'd been standing by the window the entire time, arms crossed, jaw set, watching my father the way a security director watches a suspect on camera. "Get me my phone," I said, "and that business card Harold gave you." The phone rang twice, a calm, measured voice on the other end, the kind of voice that has read 10,000 documents and is surprised by none of them. "This is Thomas Whitfield." "Mr. Whitfield, my name is Madison Clark. I think my grandfather—" He cut me off gently but firmly. "Miss Clark, I've been trying to reach you for 5 months." I gripped the phone. My ribs protested. I didn't care. "5 months?" he explained. After Harold's death, after the will was probated and the deed transfer was filed and recorded with the county, Whitfield had sent 3 certified letters to my home address. All 3 were returned unopened. He'd called the phone number Harold had provided for me, my old landline at the apartment I'd lived in before moving closer to the hotel. A man answered. The man told Whitfield that Madison Clark had moved out of state and didn't wish to be contacted. "That was my father," I said. His voice, on my old line. A pause on Whitfield's end. "I suspected as much. I debated pursuing it further, but without confirmation that you were being prevented from receiving my correspondence, I had limited grounds to— I'm in the hospital, Mr. Whitfield. I've been in a coma for 3 weeks, a cardiac emergency." Silence, then, carefully. "I'm sorry to hear that, Miss Clark. I need to know what my grandfather arranged, everything. I would prefer to tell you in person. Can I come to the hospital tomorrow morning?" "Come today." Thomas Whitfield arrived at 2 p.m. He was shorter than I'd imagined. Early 60s, charcoal suit, silver-rimmed glasses, a leather briefcase that had survived what looked like 3 decades of courtrooms and conference tables. He shook my hand gently, mindful of the IV, and pulled a chair to my bedside. Daniel stood by the window, present but not intrusive. Whitfield opened the briefcase and set a manila envelope, a thick legal folder, and a smaller sealed envelope on the blanket beside my legs. "Your grandfather came to my office 2 years before he died," Whitfield said. "He sat across from my desk and told me he wanted to make a will, not through the family attorney, not through anyone his son-in-law might know about, through me, privately, notarized by my own staff, sealed." He opened the legal folder. The will was straightforward. The house on Bryn Mawr to Madison Marie Clark solely, a trust account containing $120,000 to Madison Marie Clark solely. No other names, no conditions, no splits. "It was probated 5 months ago," he continued. "The court confirmed it. The deed transfer to your name was filed and recorded with the county. It was legal, clean, and final." I watched his face. There was more. I could see it in the way he paused, the way his fingers lingered on the edge of the next document. "But when I was unable to reach you," he said, "I ran a routine title check on the property to verify that the deed was still properly recorded." Another pause. The deed had been transferred again, Out of your name and into the name of Robert J. Clark, 3 weeks ago, using a power of attorney. I said it before he could. I never signed a power of attorney. I know you didn't. Because I have the original deed transfer from probate, notarized by my office. No POA was ever authorized by you or recorded through my firm. The signature on the document your father filed is a forgery. And the house? Whitfield lifted a third document. A lien search shows a mortgage of $350,000 recorded against the property. Issued 6 days after the fraudulent deed transfer. The loan is in your father's name, secured against your house. I stared at the IV drip, counted the drops. 1, 2, 3. He stole my house while I was in a coma. He borrowed $350,000 against it. He did this while believing I was dead, while sleeping in his own bed, while rehearsing the speech he'd give at my funeral. There's more, Whitfield said. He reached for the smaller envelope. Harold's handwriting on the front, just my name, Maddie, thin but steady. Written while he could still hold a pen. I broke the seal. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded twice. I opened it. Maddie, I know your father will try to take everything. He already has over the years. My pension checks, my savings account. Small amounts at first, then larger. He forged checks in my name. He redirected deposits. I noticed every single time. I said nothing because I didn't want to break the family apart. That was my mistake. Don't make it yours. The house is yours. The money is yours. Mr. Whitfield has all the paperwork. Don't let anyone take what belongs to you. Not your sister, not your mother's silence, and especially not your father. You are braver than me, sweetheart. You always have been. I'm sorry I didn't say this when I could still sit beside you on the porch. I cried. For the first time since waking up. For the first time since Daniel's words. Since Sandra's account. Since every cold revelation that had stacked on top of the last. I cried, not because I was broken, but because my grandfather had seen me. All of me. He'd seen the debt I carried, the silence I performed, the slow erosion of my worth inside my own family. And he hadn't just watched. He'd built something, quietly, carefully, without applause or recognition. He'd built a fortress of paper and law and love, and he'd placed it exactly where I'd find it when I needed it most. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and put his arm around my shoulders. He didn't speak. Whitfield folded his hands and waited. He'd seen this before. The moment when a document becomes a dead man's voice, when ink on paper carries more warmth than any living person in the room ever offered. When I could breathe again, Whitfield reached into the envelope one last time. He placed a small USB drive on the blanket beside Harold's letter. Your grandfather gave me this 6 months before he died. He said, if Maddie ever needs to prove what Robert's been doing, everything is on here. Daniel opened his laptop. We plugged in the drive. Inside, 5 years of records. Harold had documented everything. Bank statements with highlighted unauthorized withdrawals. Photocopies of forged checks. Robert's handwriting imitating Harold's signature, each one marked with Harold's handwritten notes. I did not write this check. Date, I noticed the discrepancy. Screenshots of pension redirect forms, showing a portion of Harold's payments routed to an account Harold had never opened. And at the bottom of the file directory, a folder labeled Victor. Inside, printed email exchanges between Robert Clark and Victor Hale. The emails discussed the old man's accounts. They referenced an exit strategy if he passes. One email, sent by Robert 11 months before Harold died, read, "She visits him every Saturday. If she finds out about the accounts, we're done. We need to move the pension redirect before tax season." I read every document, every forged check, every redirected payment, every email that treated my grandfather like a bank account and me like a threat. 5 years. My father had been stealing from Harold for 5 years, and Harold had known the entire time. He'd tracked it, documented it, organized it into folders, and handed it to a lawyer with the instruction, "Give this to Maddie when she needs it." "How long have you known about this?" I asked Whitfield. Harold showed me the evidence 18 months ago. He wanted to file charges immediately. I advised him to wait until the will was finalized and the deed was transferred and fully recorded. He agreed. He said— Whitfield paused, and for the first time his measured composure showed a crack. Maddie will finish what I started. I sat back against the pillow. I looked at the laptop screen, at 5 years of theft laid out in columns and timestamps and Harold's careful handwriting. I looked at the letter beside me on the blanket. I looked at Daniel, who was reading the emails with an expression I'd never seen on his face, a cold, focused intensity that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the absolute, irreversible decision to act. I want to file everything, I said. Void the deed. Report the forgery, notify the bank, and I want the police to see the USB drive. Whitfield nodded. I can have the motions prepared by the end of the week. I don't just want the legal process. I looked at him. My father stands in front of 150 people every month and tells them who he is. He did it while I was in a coma. He told them he prayed by my bedside every night. He cried in front of them. They applauded. I want to give those people the truth. In the same room, from the same microphone. Whitfield studied me for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly, and he said, Your grandfather told me you'd say that. He said, Maddie doesn't hide, she never has. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small calendar card. The annual fundraiser at Grace Fellowship Church. It's in 12 days. I looked at the card. 12 days. That's the one. Daniel, who had been silent through the entire meeting, finally spoke. Whatever you need. I'm there. I reached for his hand. I didn't say thank you. Some things are too large for those words. I squeezed once. He squeezed back. That was enough. 12 days. That's how long Robert Clark had left before every lie he'd built over 15 years came apart in front of the people who believed them most. He'd spend those 12 days sleeping well, rehearsing his fundraiser speech about gratitude and sacrifice, shaking hands at church, telling people he'd never left my side. He'd spend them believing he'd gotten away with everything. And on the 13th day, he'd discover that his dead father-in-law had been watching the whole time, and that the granddaughter he'd dismissed as a cost had inherited more than a house. She'd inherited the evidence and the will to use it. They discharged me on a Tuesday, 10 days after I'd opened my eyes. My ribs still ached when I breathed too deeply. The bruise along my collarbone had faded from purple to a dull yellow that looked like a stain I couldn't wash out. My left arm was out of the brace but still stiff, still reluctant to reach above shoulder height. Dr. Webb told me I'd need follow-up appointments every 2 weeks for the next 3 months. He told me to avoid stress. I almost laughed. I signed the discharge papers myself, sitting on the edge of the hospital bed in clothes Daniel had brought from my apartment, and I thought about the fact that the last time someone had signed a medical document related to my care, it was Daniel, authorizing a surgery my family had refused to pay for. Daniel arrived at 9. He brought a small duffel bag with my things and a cup of coffee from the place I liked on Walnut Street, the one that roasted their own beans and served everything in ceramic mugs even for takeout. He didn't make a speech. He didn't say, "Welcome back," or "How are you feeling," or any of the things people say when they don't know what else to offer. He picked up my bag, walked beside me to the elevator, and kept his hand near my elbow in case I needed it. I didn't. But I let him stay close anyway because closeness from Daniel wasn't obligation. It was just where he stood. My father called at 8:30 before Daniel arrived. I was sitting on the hospital bed waiting, my phone on the blanket beside me, his name on the screen. I picked up. "I'm coming to get you," he said. "You're staying with us until you're back on your feet. No arguments." He didn't ask. He announced it. The way he announced everything. The voice of a man who had been making decisions for other people for so long that he'd forgotten the difference between authority and control. "That's really kind, Dad, but Daniel's already arranged everything. I'll be staying at his apartment. It's closer to my cardiologist." Silence on the line. 3 seconds. 4. I could hear him recalculating, the way a machine recalibrates when it encounters unexpected input. "You'd rather stay with your boyfriend than your own family?" I noted the word. Boyfriend, not fiancé. Robert had never acknowledged the engagement. He'd never said Daniel's name with any warmth, never treated the relationship as anything more than a temporary inconvenience that would eventually resolve itself the way he believed all of my decisions eventually resolved themselves, quietly, without consequence, in his favor. "He's my fiancé, Dad. And he's been at the hospital every day for 3 weeks." Something shifted in his breathing, a tightness, a pause that lasted half a second too long. But the connection didn't land. He didn't link Daniel's constant presence to the healthcare proxy, to the surgery authorization, to the fact that his daughter was alive because the man he called boyfriend had flown 6,000 miles to sign a piece of paper Robert had refused to touch. "Fine," he said. He hung up without saying goodbye. 30 minutes later, Olivia texted, "Dad's really hurt. You're being ungrateful after everything he's been through." I read it. I set my phone face down on the hospital bed. I didn't respond. I was done performing gratitude for people who had decided my life wasn't worth $200,000. Sandra Nguyen caught me at the hospital exit. I was walking through the lobby, Daniel beside me, the automatic doors 10 feet away. Sandra stepped out from behind the information desk in her scrubs, her shift clearly not over, and pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. "My personal number," she said. "If you ever need me to testify, I will." I looked at her. Her eyes were steady, the same eyes that had watched my father walk away, that had found the proxy, that had made the call to Paris. "What they did wasn't just wrong," she said. "It was criminal, and I don't forget." I nodded. I put the paper in my pocket. She went back through the double doors without another word. Daniel's apartment was on the 14th floor of a building in Center City. Clean, modern, large windows overlooking the Schuylkill River. His dining table, usually covered with hotel industry reports and acquisition spreadsheets, had been cleared. In its place, a landscape I recognized immediately. Whitfield's legal folder, printed copies of every file from the USB drive. Sandra's incident report, my healthcare proxy documentation, and a yellow legal pad covered in my own handwriting. Timeline, names, amounts, dates. I'd started writing it in the hospital bed, between visits from Robert and conversations with Whitfield, filling in the architecture of what my father had done while I lay unconscious. Now the pad sat on Daniel's dining table like the blueprint for a building I was about to construct. Whitfield arrived at 2. He set his briefcase beside the legal folder, sat across from Daniel and me, and laid out the strategy with the same measured precision he brought to everything. The motion to void the fraudulent deed transfer was ready to file. The forged POA had no corresponding record in any legitimate database, except Victor Hale's stamp. The original deed from probate, notarized by Whitfield's office, superseded everything Robert had filed. The police report was drafted. Forgery, fraud, mortgage fraud. The USB drive contents constituted evidence of a criminal pattern spanning 5 years. The bank notification was prepared. Once filed, the title dispute would trigger an immediate freeze on the mortgage. Robert would lose access to any remaining funds. I listened. I asked questions about timelines, about sequence, about which filings would trigger which responses, and in what order. Whitfield answered each one. He was thorough, he was patient. He recommended filing everything quietly. Let the courts handle it. Let the police investigate. Avoid the spectacle. I let him finish. Then I said what I'd been thinking since the moment I read Harold's letter. He stood in front of 150 people 3 weeks ago and told them he prayed by my bedside every night. He cried in front of them. They applauded. He lied to every person in that room, people who trust him, people who gave him their money to manage, in the same building where my grandfather sat every Sunday for 27 years. I paused. I'm going to tell the truth in that room. Same microphone, same people. Whitfield studied me. He didn't argue. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He looked at me the way I imagined he'd looked at Harold when Harold first walked into his office and said he needed a secret will, assessing not whether I was capable, but whether I understood the weight of what I was choosing. "Your grandfather told me you'd handle it your way," Whitfield said. "He told me, Maddie doesn't hide, she never has." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the calendar card. The annual fundraiser at Grace Fellowship Church, this Sunday. 5 days. That was all the time I had, and Robert didn't suspect a thing. Wednesday evening, Robert called again. His voice was relaxed, conversational, the tone of a man who has checked every lock in his house and found them all secure. "How are you feeling, sweetheart? Getting enough rest?" I matched his tone. "Much better, Dad. Daniel's taking good care of me." We talked about nothing. The weather, the Phillies, a bathroom renovation he'd finished for a client on Saturday, 2 people speaking lines from scripts that had nothing to do with each other, performing normalcy across a phone line while one of us held a folder full of evidence and the other didn't know it existed. Then he shifted, the way a hotel guest shifts when they're about to request something they know they're not entitled to. Casual, too casual. "Oh, I meant to tell you. I've been going through Grandpa Harold's things, the house, the paperwork, some old accounts. It's more complicated than I expected, but I'm handling it. I'll explain everything when you're feeling up to it." He paused. He waited, listening for a crack, a question, a tremor in my voice that would tell him I'd been talking to someone I shouldn't have been talking to. I gave him nothing. "That's really thoughtful of you, Dad. I know it's a lot of work. Thank you." I heard him relax through the phone, the slight exhale, the loosening of the muscles in his jaw. He thought the script was still working. He thought I was still the girl who accepted what she was told and said thank you for the privilege. "Of course," he said. "That's what family's for." I hung up. Daniel was leaning against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Sound that calm when you know what he's done?" I looked at him. "I've been managing difficult guests for 11 years. My father's just another one who thinks the rules don't apply to him." I picked up the legal pad and wrote a note. "Robert confirmed. Believes I know nothing about property. Actively maintaining cover story." Thursday morning, Daniel found something new. He'd been pulling records on Robert's financial trail, using his own industry contacts in commercial real estate and hospitality finance. The failed plaza development, the Glen Archer project that had swallowed Robert's savings, was structured as an LLC. Glen Archer was listed as managing member. Robert was listed as investor. But there was a third name on the operating agreement. Olivia Clark. Not as an investor, as the registered agent. Olivia had helped incorporate the LLC. Her real estate license number appeared on the formation documents. She'd used her brokerage credentials to legitimize the project for Robert's loan applications. She wasn't a bystander who'd been pulled into her father's orbit. She was a structural participant. She'd used her professional standing to prop up the investment that eventually collapsed and created the debt spiral that led to everything. The theft from Harold, the forged POA, the stolen house, the mortgage, and the night she stood in a hospital waiting room and said, "Let her die," because my death would have solved a financial problem she'd helped create. Daniel showed me the documents at the kitchen table. I read them twice. I didn't speak for a full minute. Then I said, "She wasn't just following Dad. She had her own reasons to want me gone." Daniel nodded. "If you hadn't survived, and the estate went through standard probate without a named beneficiary, the property could have been contested. With Olivia's real estate license, she could have managed the sale, taken a commission, and pocketed her share on top of the cut from Robert. Your death was worth money to both of them." I picked up the legal pad. I wrote one line. Olivia, not a bystander. A partner. Then I turned the page and started planning Sunday. Let me tell you about my father's church, because you need to understand what he was about to lose. Grace Fellowship Church sits on a tree-lined road in a suburb west of Philadelphia. White steeple, red brick. A parking lot that fills up by 9:45 every Sunday. About 150 people attend weekly. Families, retirees, small business owners, teachers, the kind of congregation where everyone knows your name, your children's names, and what you brought to the last potluck. Robert Clark had been the head of the church's finance committee for 12 years. He managed the community outreach fund. He organized the annual fundraiser. He balanced the books every quarter and presented the reports at board meetings with the confidence of a man who believed his own competence was indistinguishable from his character. Pastor Michael mentioned him in sermons. A man of integrity and generosity. Those were the words. I'd heard them so many times they'd lost their meaning. The way a word repeated over and over becomes just a sound. Robert shook every hand after the service. He asked about people's children by name. He remembered birthdays, anniversaries, surgeries. When someone's furnace broke in January, Robert fixed it for free and wouldn't take $1. When the church needed a new roof, Robert led the fundraising campaign and wrote the first check. 150 people believed in this man. People. They believed in him the way you believe in a foundation, without thinking about it, without questioning whether it's solid, because it's always been there and it's never cracked. Every year, the first Sunday in October, Grace Fellowship held its biggest event, the annual fundraiser for the community outreach program. Potluck lunch, silent auction, a speaking program where church leaders shared testimonies and blessings. Robert always spoke. He always talked about family, about sacrifice, about what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. 150 people would be in that fellowship hall. Folding tables, paper plates, a standing microphone near the front plugged into a small speaker that hummed with the quiet patience of a stage waiting for its actor. Sunday was 4 days away. Whitfield had the filings ready. Daniel had the evidence backed up to 2 separate cloud accounts. Sandra had offered to testify. The folder on the dining table was 3 inches thick. I added the LLC documents to it Thursday evening, slid them behind the emails from the USB drive, and closed the folder. Robert Clark had 4 days of peace left. He was spending them rehearsing a speech about gratitude. I woke up at 5 on Sunday morning. I hadn't set an alarm. I'd been awake since 4, lying in Daniel's bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Not from nerves. I'd expected nerves. I'd expected the racing pulse, the tight stomach, the restless energy that comes before something irreversible. But what I felt instead was calm. A deep, settled calm. The kind that arrives not when you've made peace with a decision, but when the decision was made long ago, and all that's left is the walking through. I lay there for an hour listening to Daniel breathe beside me. Steady, even. The breathing of a man who slept well because he'd done what needed doing and the rest was tomorrow's work. I thought about Harold, about the porch swing, about the scrambled eggs and the vegetable garden, and the way he'd say, "Tell me about your week, sweetheart," like there was nothing in the world more important than my answer. I thought about the letter, about the USB drive, about a man who spent the last 2 years of his life building a case against his own son-in-law, because he loved his granddaughter more than he loved keeping the peace. At 6, I got up, I showered. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself. The bruise along my jawline was almost gone. The one under my left eye had faded to a faint green that you'd only notice if you were looking for it. My collarbone was still tender when I lifted my arm too high. I looked like someone who'd survived something. Because I had. I'd survived a heart defect at 2. I'd survived a childhood built on guilt and debt. I'd survived a sister who said, "Let her die," and a father who nodded. I was still here. And in a few hours, 150 people were going to find out why. I put on a white button-down blouse and dark slacks. Simple, clean. No jewelry except the small silver earrings Harold had given me on my 21st birthday. He'd wrapped them in tissue paper and handed them to me on the porch swing. "These were your grandmother Margaret's," he'd said. "She'd want you to have them." I'd worn them to every important moment since. Job interviews, the day I got promoted to general manager, the night Daniel proposed. They were small enough that most people didn't notice them. But I knew they were there, and today Harold would be there too. I pulled my hair back. I didn't bother with makeup. I didn't need the room to see a polished version of me. I needed them to see my face clearly. The bruises, the fatigue, the evidence of what I'd been through. That was enough. I picked up the manila folder from the dining table. Inside, arranged in order, copies of Harold's will with the notary seal, the original deed in my name, the county line records showing Robert's mortgage, Sandra's incident report with timestamps and exact words, printed emails from the USB drive including the one about the pension redirect, and the LLC formation document with Olivia's name and license number. I slid the folder into my bag. It weighed almost nothing. It would dismantle everything. Daniel drove. We didn't talk. The radio was off. The city passed in silence, row houses giving way to strip malls giving way to two-lane roads and trees, oaks and maples just beginning to turn, edges of red, veins of gold, the slow, quiet performance of a season letting go. I watched the trees and thought about how change looks beautiful from a distance and violent up close. Every red leaf was a cell dying. Every golden edge was a branch saying goodbye. From a car window, it looked like art. From inside the leaf, it was the end of the world. Daniel turned onto the church road at 11:20 and parked near the back of the lot. The steeple caught the morning sun, white against a blue October sky. The parking lot was already filling up. Minivans and sedans and a few pickup trucks. The vehicles of families who came every Sunday and stayed for the potluck because the fellowship hall had better coffee than most diners in the county. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked. He was looking at me the way he'd looked at me on the night he proposed. The same steadiness, the same willingness to follow wherever my answer led. "I've never been more sure of anything." He reached across the console and squeezed my hand. "I'll be right there with you, whatever happens." I nodded. I opened the car door. Whitfield was already there. I spotted him near the entrance, charcoal suit, leather briefcase, standing beside the handicap ramp with the patience of a man who billed by the hour and had nowhere else to be. He looked like what he was, a small-town attorney with 3 decades of probate experience who had been handed the most important case of his career by an 81-year-old man in a rocking chair. He saw me. He gave a single nod. I nodded back. I walked through the front doors. The service was already underway. Hymns, warm air, the smell of old carpet and fresh coffee, and the particular mustiness of a building that has held the same people's prayers for 50 years. Sunlight came through the stained glass in long-colored bars that fell across the pews like God's own highlighter, marking the passages he wanted people to pay attention to. I slipped into the last pew and sat down. My ribs protested. I ignored them. Robert was in the second row, right side, where he always sat. Navy blazer, pressed white shirt, Bible open on his lap. He was nodding along to the hymn with the practiced rhythm of a man who had memorized not just the words but the performance of singing them. He looked peaceful, certain, untouchable. Like a man standing in a house he built, confident that every nail is where he put it, unaware that someone has been quietly removing the foundation for months. He spotted me. He always noticed when someone entered his territory. An old habit, a deacon's awareness. He turned, saw me in the back pew, and his face lit up with exactly the expression I expected. The proud father, the grateful patriarch. He raised his hand and waved. A warm wave, a public wave. The wave that said, "Look everyone, my miracle daughter is here." She came to church. I waved back, small, patient. The wave you give to someone who has no idea what's coming. Olivia was 2 seats from Robert, legs crossed, phone in her lap, a fixed smile that had been applied like makeup and had about as much warmth. She glanced at me. She didn't wave. Something tightened in her expression, a flicker of discomfort, the look of someone who expected a problem to have resolved itself by now and was unsettled to find it still breathing. Daniel entered through the side door and positioned himself near the back wall. Whitfield came in separately and sat in the last row on the opposite side. They didn't acknowledge each other. They didn't need to. The pieces were in place. The service ended at noon. The congregation filed into the fellowship hall through double doors propped open with rubber wedges. A wide, low-ceilinged room with fluorescent lights and folding tables arranged in rows. Foil pans of baked ziti and green bean casserole, crockpots plugged into extension cords that snaked between table legs, paper plates stacked beside plastic cups, and a napkin dispenser that someone had decorated with a handwritten sign, "Bless this meal." The standing microphone near the front was plugged into a small speaker that hummed. Robert walked to the microphone. He buttoned his blazer. He clasped his hands in front of him and waited for the room to settle. Chairs scraped against linoleum. Children darted between tables. An elderly woman in the third row adjusted her hearing aid. A man in a plaid shirt poured lemonade for his wife. The room quieted, the way rooms quiet for Robert Clark, naturally, respectfully, because he'd earned every ear through 12 years of balanced ledgers and fixed furnaces and handshakes that never felt hurried. "Good afternoon, everyone. Before we eat, I want to start with something personal today." The room gave him its full attention. I watched from the back wall beside the coffee table. Daniel was 6 feet to my left. Whitfield was seated in the last row near the side door. "As many of you know," Robert continued, "my youngest daughter, Madison, had a serious cardiac emergency last month. She was rushed to the hospital. She was in a coma for 3 weeks. He paused. He was good at pauses. He let the weight build the way a preacher lets silence build before the point of the sermon, not for emphasis, but for control. He was managing the room's emotions the way he managed their charitable fund, methodically, with a clear objective. But God is faithful. He turned and gestured toward me. I was standing near the back wall. Every head in the room rotated. 150 faces. Some I recognized from Harold's funeral, some I'd never seen before. Applause. Warm, genuine applause. A woman in the front row pressed her hand to her heart. A man in the plaid shirt set down the lemonade pitcher and nodded with tears forming at the corners of his eyes. These people meant it. They were clapping because they were good people who believed a father had nearly lost his daughter and God had brought her back. They had no reason to think otherwise. "As a father," Robert said, his voice cracking at precisely the right moment, at the exact syllable where a crack would sound most human. "There is nothing more terrifying than almost losing your child. I sat by her bedside every night. I prayed. I begged God to bring her back to us." He pressed his hand to his chest. And he did. I felt the words land in my body, not like a wound, like a key turning in a lock I didn't know I'd been carrying. Every night. He'd said that to 150 people. I sat by her bedside every night. The man who signed nothing, who walked out at 9:52, who called 3 weeks later to collect a dead woman's belongings. That man was standing at a microphone with his hand on his heart telling 150 people he'd prayed by my side. He looked at me across the room. He smiled. He opened his arms slightly, the subtle, universal gesture of a father inviting his daughter into the narrative he'd written for her. The role was simple. Walk to the front, hug him, cry into his shoulder, confirm the story, be the miracle, be grateful. I smiled back. I walked toward him. The room watched with soft, expectant eyes. I could feel the warmth of 150 people who wanted this to be the moment, the tearful reunion, the father and daughter, the answered prayer. I walked all the way to the front. "Dad," I said, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear, "can I say a few words?" Robert didn't hesitate. He couldn't. Not here. Not in front of 150 people who just heard him call me his miracle. Refusing his daughter the microphone after that speech, after the applause, after the tears, would crack the mask in real time, in front of every person who believed in him. He knew it. I knew he knew it. "Of course, sweetheart." His smile was wide, confident. He stepped to the side, hands behind his back, playing the supporting role with the ease of a man who has never doubted his ability to control any room he stands in. I wrapped my fingers around the microphone. It was warm from his grip. I didn't look at him. I looked at the room, at the folding tables and the casserole dishes and the faces. Mrs. Delgado, who brought empanadas every month. Jim Hartley, whose gutters Robert cleaned every spring. Pastor Michael standing near the punch bowl with his hands in his pockets. Ruth Calloway, who'd sung in the choir with Harold for 15 years. These were good people. They'd trusted this man. They deserved the truth. "Thank you all for your prayers," I said. "I'm truly grateful to be standing here." I paused, not for effect, because I wanted the next sentence to land in the exact place it needed to, in the silence between one heartbeat and the next, in the space where 150 people were still smiling, still warm, still believing the story they'd been told. But I need to correct something my father just said. The silence changed. It wasn't the comfortable, anticipatory silence of a church gathering anymore. It was the silence of a room that has felt the floor shift beneath it, just barely, just enough to make everyone grip the edge of their chairs without knowing why. Robert's smile faded by 1 degree. His hands came out from behind his back, and I began. My father didn't pray by my bedside. He came to the hospital once, the night of my emergency. He went to the financial counselor's office before he asked which room I was in. He asked how much the surgery would cost. When they told him over $200,000 after insurance, he did not sign the consent form. He left the hospital without authorizing the procedure. The room didn't move. 150 people were holding forks that didn't reach their mouths. A woman in the second row set down her plastic cup of lemonade with the slow, careful motion of someone who has just realized that the surface beneath her is not as stable as she thought. I kept my eyes on the room. I didn't look at Robert, not yet. But my father didn't make that decision alone. I paused. I turned slightly, not toward Olivia, toward the congregation. Toward the people who needed to hear this from the front of the room, where the truth belongs. My sister Olivia was at the hospital that night. She arrived at 9:45. She found my father in the waiting area outside the surgical wing. A charge nurse, a 12-year veteran of that hospital, was standing 12 feet away restocking a supply cart. She heard every word. My voice dropped half a register. Not for drama, because the next sentence deserved a different weight. The kind of weight that doesn't come from volume, but from stillness. My sister looked at my father and said, "Let her die. We won't pay for the surgery. Think about what that money could do for us." Someone in the middle of the hall inhaled sharply. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with both hands. Near the back, a dish hit the linoleum, a casserole lid that slipped from someone's fingers. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Stopping would have given Robert a gap to fill with his own version, and I was done letting him fill gaps. My father looked at my sister. He nodded. They stood up. They walked out of the hospital together. Nobody signed the surgical consent form. Nobody came back. Nobody called. Nobody checked. Robert stepped forward. His hand reached toward me. The instinctive gesture of a man who has spent 12 years managing rooms and believes he can still manage this one. "Madison, stop. You're confused. The medication, the trauma, you don't know what you're—" I didn't turn to face him. I spoke to the room. "I have the hospital's incident report, time-stamped, the nurse's written account, exact words, exact times. I'm not confused." Robert's hand dropped to his side. I could feel him recalculating beside me, the way a machine reprocesses when it encounters a wall where a door used to be. I gave him no time to find another route. And that's not even the worst part. Daniel walked from the back wall to the front of the room. He didn't rush. He carried a thin folder against his side, held loosely, the way someone carries something they've been holding for 3 weeks and are finally ready to set down. He stood beside me. Not in front of me, beside me. His presence didn't overshadow the moment, it reinforced it. He wasn't the hero of this story. He was the witness who could prove it. "My name is Daniel Reed," he said to the room. His voice was steady, clear, the voice of a man who runs international hotel operations and is accustomed to addressing rooms full of people who need facts, not feelings. I'm Madison's fiancé. 3 years ago, she designated me as her healthcare proxy, her legal medical decision maker. He held up the document. The notary seal caught the fluorescent light. The night of her emergency, a nurse at the hospital found this designation in Madison's employee records. She called me in Paris at 3 a.m. I authorized the surgery by phone and flew back to sign the consent form in person. He opened the folder. This is a copy of the formal incident record filed by the attending charge nurse. It documents the family's refusal to authorize life-saving surgery. It includes exact timestamps, the names of every person present, and the direct quote from Olivia Clark. Daniel looked at Robert. Just once. Just long enough. Robert's face had gone the color of old newspaper, the yellowish gray of something that has been left out too long and has started to deteriorate. Daniel said one sentence to him. You left your daughter to die over a billing estimate. I flew 6,000 miles to save her. Then he stepped back. He didn't say anything else. The room heard him. The room would remember. The side door of the fellowship hall opened. Thomas Whitfield walked in. Charcoal suit, leather briefcase, silver-rimmed glasses. He didn't look around for a seat. He didn't hesitate. He walked directly to the front, set his briefcase on the nearest folding table, and stood beside me with the quiet authority of a man who has stood in rooms like this before and understands that the law doesn't need to raise its voice. I watched Robert's face. I watched it carefully, the way I'd watched 1,000 faces across hotel lobbies and conference tables, reading the micro-expressions that tell you what a person is really thinking before their mouth catches up. And I saw something I had never seen on my father's face in 33 years. Fear. Not anger, not indignation, not the rehearsed composure of a man preparing his defense. Fear. The deep, stomach-level fear of a man who has just realized that the door he thought was locked has been open the entire time. This is Thomas Whitfield, I said into the microphone. He was my grandfather Harold's private attorney. A murmur rippled through the room. Harold Bennett's name still carried weight here. He'd sat in the 4th row of this church for 27 years. He'd brought homemade apple butter to every potluck until his arthritis stopped him. He'd sung in the choir with Ruth Calloway. These people knew him. These people respected him. And they were about to find out why he'd hired a lawyer in secret. My grandfather left me his house and a trust fund in a will that was notarized, probated, and confirmed by the county court 6 months ago. I let that settle. 3 seconds of silence. He didn't tell my father. He didn't tell my sister. He came to Mr. Whitfield privately, because he didn't trust his own son-in-law with it. While I was in a coma, I continued, while my father believed I was going to die, he discovered the will. He forged my signature on a power of attorney. He transferred the house into his name, and he took out a $350,000 mortgage against it. Gasps. A chair scraped backward hard enough to screech. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," and didn't bother keeping it to a whisper. Near the back, a man I didn't recognize stood up halfway out of his seat, then sat back down, as if the weight of what he'd just heard pushed him back into the chair. Whitfield opened his briefcase. He lifted the original will. He held it so the people in the front rows could see the notary seal, the signatures, the official stamp that made it real. "I have the original will right here, Mr. Clark." His voice was even, almost gentle. The gentleness of a man who knows that the documents in his hand are doing all the damage and his tone doesn't need to. "Your name does not appear anywhere in this document." He set it on the table. He lifted the deed. "This is the original deed transfer, recorded by the county, confirming Madison Marie Clark as sole owner." He set it beside the will. "And this," he lifted a third document, "is the lien search showing a mortgage of $350,000 recorded against this property in your name, Mr. Clark, using a forged power of attorney." Robert's voice came out louder now, strained, the voice of a man whose script has been torn up in front of him. That house belongs to the family. Harold would have wanted it shared. He wouldn't have... Whitfield. Harold wanted his granddaughter to have it. That's why he put it in writing. That's why he hired me. That's why he came to my office instead of yours. I wasn't finished. I reached into my folder and pulled out the printed emails. My grandfather kept records. For 5 years, he documented unauthorized withdrawals from his bank accounts, forged checks, redirected pension payments, thousands of dollars taken without his knowledge or consent, all traced back to my father. I held up one printed page. This is an email between my father and his notary, Victor Hale, written 11 months before my grandfather died. It reads, "She visits him every Saturday. If she finds out about the accounts, we're done. We need to move the pension redirect before tax season." The room was silent. Not the silence of people waiting for more. The silence of people who have heard enough and are trying to process what it means. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Someone's phone vibrated against a table. Nobody reached for it. And my sister wasn't just a bystander. I pulled out the LLC formation document. Olivia Clark is listed as the registered agent on the investment LLC that my father used to lose over $400,000 in a failed real estate project. She used her brokerage license to legitimize the venture. She wasn't just aware of the financial collapse. She helped build the structure that caused it. I set the document on the table beside the will. And when my father offered her $100,000 from the mortgage he took out on my stolen house, she didn't ask questions. She used the money to open a second office. Olivia stood up. Her chair scraped the floor with a sound that cut through the silence like a blade across glass. Her face was white, not from shock, from recognition. The look of someone who has just watched every layer of careful distance she'd built between herself and the truth get peeled away in front of an audience she can never unface. "Tell them, Olivia," Robert said. His voice had shifted again, desperate now, reaching. "Tell them I was protecting the family. Tell them—" Olivia pulled her arm free from his grip. She looked at him, then at me, then at the room, at Mrs. Delgado, at Jim Hartley, at the couples whose homes she'd sold, the families who'd trusted her with the biggest financial decisions of their lives. She looked at all of them looking at her. She didn't make a speech. She didn't defend herself. She said 4 words, quietly, but in a room that silent, everyone heard them. "I knew it was wrong." Then she picked up her purse and walked toward the door. Before she reached it, she stopped. She turned back. She looked at me. Not with anger, not with defiance, with something I didn't expect and still don't fully understand. Something that looked like relief. The terrible, exhausted relief of someone who has finally stopped pretending. Then she walked out. The door closed behind her. Robert tried every tactic he had left. "She's on heavy medication. She doesn't know what she's saying." Nobody moved. "This is a private family matter. This isn't the place." I answered that one. "You chose this room to tell your story. I'm choosing the same room to tell the truth." He shifted to the last card in his hand, the one he always played when authority and deflection failed. He softened. He dropped his shoulders. He let his voice crack the way he'd been cracking it professionally for 12 years. "I've sacrificed everything for this family. You have no idea the pressure I've been under. The debts, He stopped. His mouth closed. He'd caught himself, but too late. The word debts had already landed, and 150 people were turning it over in their minds, connecting it to the forged checks and the failed investment and the $350,000. Jim Hartley stood up from his chair, the man whose gutters Robert cleaned every spring, the man whose handshake Robert never missed. "Then why is there a lawyer here, Robert?" Robert didn't answer. Pastor Michael stepped forward from beside the punch bowl. His hands were no longer in his pockets. They were folded in front of him, the posture of a man who has presided over enough difficult conversations to know when the room needs direction. "Robert," he said quietly, "I think we should all hear this out. Every word." I lowered the microphone. I didn't need it for this part. The room was silent enough to hear a page turn. "I'm not here to humiliate you, Dad. I'm here because you tried to let me die. When that didn't work, you robbed me. You forged my signature. You stole my grandfather's house. You took $350,000 to cover debts you never told anyone about. And you stood at this microphone and told these people who trust you, people who gave you their charitable fund to manage, that you never left my side." I looked at him. "I'm giving you a chance to make it right. That's more than you gave me." Robert looked around the room. The slow rotation of a man searching for an ally and finding none. Face by face, Jim Hartley, Mrs. Delgado, Pastor Michael, Ruth Calloway, the man in the plaid shirt who'd cried during Robert's speech 5 minutes ago. Every one of them looked back at him. Not one of them looked away. Not one of them moved toward him. Pastor Michael walked to Robert. He placed a hand on his shoulder. Firm, not gentle. "Robert, I think it's time for you to leave." Robert stood still for a moment. Then he walked toward the door. His shoes were silent on the linoleum. At the threshold, he turned. He looked at me across the fellowship hall, across the folding tables and the casserole dishes and the 150 people who would never see him the same way again. His mouth opened. He wanted to say something. Some final line that would land the way his speeches always landed, that would rewrite the last 10 minutes into something he could survive. Nothing came out. He left. I set the microphone on the nearest table. My hands were steady. My ribs ached. I didn't care. I looked at the room. "I'm sorry for disrupting your Sunday. My grandfather Harold loved this church. He sat in the 4th row for 27 years. He would have wanted the truth spoken here." Mrs. Delgado came forward and hugged me, tight, wordless, the kind of embrace that carries everything language can't. Jim Hartley shook my hand without speaking. Ruth Calloway, white hair, cardigan, glasses on a chain around her neck, touched my arm and said, "Your grandfather talked about you every single week, sweetheart. He never stopped. He was so proud of you." I nodded. I couldn't trust my voice. I'd held it together for every word of that confrontation. And now, standing in front of a woman who'd known Harold for 20 years, I could feel the edges starting to give. Sandra Nguyen was standing near the coffee station. She'd arrived before the service in civilian clothes, sitting in the back row, invisible and watching. She caught my eye across the room. She didn't smile. She gave a single firm nod, the same nod she'd given at the hospital exit when she'd pressed her phone number into my hand. The nod that meant, I was here. I saw this. And I'll swear to every word. I know this is a lot. If this story is hitting you hard, you're not alone. Thousands of people have watched stories like this one and felt exactly what you're feeling right now. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment. Hit that button so you don't miss how this ends. And tell me in the comments, what would you have said to Robert right there in front of everyone? I want to hear it. Now let me tell you what happened next. I slept for 11 hours Monday night. The first real sleep since waking from the coma. I lay in Daniel's bed and closed my eyes at 8:30 and didn't open them until 7:30 the next morning. My body was still healing. My ribs still caught when I rolled over. But something had shifted. The weight I'd been carrying since childhood, the invisible debt, the permanent apology for existing, the belief that I owed my family something I could never repay, was lighter, not gone, lighter. Like someone had cut one of the straps on a pack I'd been wearing for 33 years, and I could finally feel the difference between what I was carrying and what I was. Whitfield called at 8. He'd filed the title dispute with the mortgage lender's fraud department at first light. By 9:15, the bank's internal counsel had called him back. The title was flagged as disputed. The mortgage was frozen, effective immediately. Robert could not access any remaining funds. He could not refinance. He could not sell. He could not transfer. The $350,000 he'd already withdrawn was now unsecured debt, money he owed against a property he had no legal right to touch. Monday afternoon, Whitfield filed the motion to void the fraudulent deed transfer with the county court. The filing included the original probated will, the legitimate deed in my name, the forged power of attorney, and a forensic handwriting analysis Whitfield had commissioned during my hospital stay. The analysis was conclusive. The signature on the POA did not match my known handwriting. It matched Robert's attempt to replicate it. The expert's report was 4 pages long. It took one sentence to summarize. This signature was written by someone imitating the subject's hand, not by the subject herself. At 2 p.m. Monday, Whitfield and I walked into the Bryn Mawr police station. I filed a formal complaint. Forgery in the 3rd degree. Fraud. Mortgage fraud. The report named Robert J. Clark as the primary suspect and Victor Hale as an accessory. The USB drive contents were submitted as supporting evidence, 5 years of forged checks, redirected pension payments, and the email chain between Robert and Victor that included the sentence about moving the pension redirect before tax season. The detective who took the report read the emails carefully. He looked up at me over his reading glasses and said, "How long has this been going on?" I said, "Longer than I knew, but my grandfather kept records." The detective nodded. He picked up his phone and called his supervisor before I'd left the room. By Tuesday morning, Victor Hale had hired his own attorney. His lawyer called Whitfield before noon and signaled immediate cooperation. Victor wasn't going down for Robert Clark. He'd notarized the forged document. He'd stamped it without verification. He knew it was irregular, and he'd done it anyway because Robert had leverage over his tax filings. But when the leverage was a favor owed, and the consequence was a felony charge, the math changed fast. Victor provided a sworn statement confirming that Robert brought the POA to his office, that the signature appeared irregular, that Robert pressured him to notarize it without standard verification. Victor also confirmed that Robert had used his office for previous document services, including notarization of the forged checks used to drain Harold's accounts over 5 years. Victor had kept copies of everything. He turned it all over. By Tuesday evening, Robert Clark was served with a summons at his front door. A process server knocked at 3:15 p.m. Robert's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Diane, was pulling weeds in the front yard next door and watched the entire exchange. She told a friend at church. The friend told 3 more. By Wednesday, the story had traveled through the congregation faster than any sermon Robert had ever delivered. The church board held an emergency meeting Tuesday night. Robert was asked to resign from the finance committee. The vote was unanimous. Pastor Michael called Robert personally to deliver the decision. Robert didn't answer the first call. When he picked up the second, he said 3 words. "I understand, Pastor." Then he hung up. 12 years of Sunday speeches, quarterly reports, fundraising campaigns, furnace repairs, and handshakes that felt like contracts, gone in a single phone call on a Tuesday evening. Robert's plumbing and contracting business depended almost entirely on church referrals and community word of mouth. By Wednesday, 3 clients had canceled scheduled work. By Thursday, 7 more. Jim Hartley texted him a single sentence. "Don't come to my house again, Robert." Mrs. Delgado called to cancel a bathroom renovation she'd been planning for months. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. The silence on Robert's end of the line was the sound of a man who understood that some cancellations don't come with a rebooking option. By Friday, Robert Clark was a man whose phone had stopped ringing. No clients, no church calls, no invitations. No one stopping by to talk about the game or borrow a pipe wrench or drop off leftovers from Sunday dinner. The community he'd spent 15 years constructing hadn't collapsed. It had simply turned away. Quietly, completely, with the particular finality of a congregation that has discovered the man who balanced their books can't be trusted with a pen. Robert called me Thursday night, 10:47 p.m. I was sitting on Daniel's couch with a heating pad across my ribs and a cup of chamomile tea going cold on the coffee table. My phone buzzed. his name on the screen. I stared at it for 2 full rings. Then I picked up. "You destroyed me." His voice was flat, not angry, not pleading, hollowed out, like a building after the wrecking ball has gone through, the walls still standing but nothing inside holding them up. I'd heard that tone before, in hotel guests who'd been caught in a lie and had exhausted every alternative. The difference was I used to feel responsible for making it better. I used to fill the silence with reassurance, with softness, with the automatic impulse to smooth things over that Robert had trained into me since I was 6 years old. I didn't feel that anymore. "No, Dad, you destroyed yourself. I just stopped covering for you." Silence. 5 seconds, 7, 10. "You could have handled this privately," he said. "You could have come to me." "I was in a coma, Dad. You could have signed a piece of paper. You could have stayed. You could have done the bare minimum a father is supposed to do. You didn't." "I was scared," he said. "Of the money, of the debt, of everything." "Of me," I finished. "You were scared of what I'd cost you. You've been scared of that since I was 2 years old." He didn't deny it. I waited. I gave him the space I used to fill with apologies and accommodation. I let the silence sit between us, like a third person in the room, taking up the space that my guilt used to occupy. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said finally. "It went exactly as far as you took it, Dad." He hung up. I set the phone face down on the table. Daniel looked at me from the kitchen doorway. I shook my head once. There was nothing to discuss. The conversation was over, not just that phone call, all of it. Whitfield called me Friday morning, 9 a.m. His voice had the careful precision I'd learned to associate with news he'd rehearsed before delivering. "There's one more thing, Miss Clark. I found it during a routine review of your financial records, the ones we pulled for the fraud filing." I sat down at the dining table, legal pad ready, pen in hand. "What is it?" 6 months before my cardiac emergency, Robert had changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy. The original beneficiary was Daniel Reed. I'd listed him when we got engaged, through the same process where I'd signed the healthcare proxy, standard legal housekeeping. The new beneficiary on file was Robert J. Clark. My signature was on the change form. I had never signed it. Whitfield laid it out without editorializing. If I had died in that hospital, if Daniel hadn't been called, if the surgery hadn't been authorized, if Robert's refusal had succeeded, and the machines had stopped and the chaplain had called with a time of death, Robert would have collected on my life insurance policy. Combined with the house and the mortgage, my death would have been worth over $500,000 to the man who'd raised me. "He didn't just refuse to save you," Whitfield said. "He had a financial incentive for you not to survive." I sat at the table and stared at the legal pad. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I was past the point where new revelations could wound me in the ways they were supposed to. Each one since I'd woken up had peeled back another layer of the same truth, the truth I'd been circling my entire life without ever landing on it directly. My father saw me as a liability. Every decision he'd made, from the moment the surgeon's bill arrived when I was 2 years old, was designed to minimize his exposure to the cost of my existence. The life insurance wasn't a new betrayal. It was the most honest expression of the one he'd been committing for 33 years. "Add it to the police report," I said, "and send a copy to the fraud department at the insurance company." "Already done," Whitfield said. I set the pen down. I thought about Harold's letter. "Don't let